one of our first dates that we had, my current husband, that I sat down across from him and I kind of came out with this checklist. I wasn't physically holding a checklist, but I think it was like this mental. And I went through all of these questions on his religious beliefs, on his spending habits, on his, like all of these things, because I thought to myself, okay, I've done this twice already. Like I'm not necessarily looking for a third marriage. That wasn't why I was dating, but I'm like, I'm not going to waste my time and I want to make sure that we're aligned. And if we're not, it's okay. We can release and let go and have peace with that. But I'm going to be really clear.
Loverly presents The Wedding Podcast, a show for those on the road to I do. From relationship advice to wedding planning tips, we break it down. I'm your host, Kelly Khalil, bride-to-be and the founder of Loverly, a DIY wedding planning platform. Over the years, we've helped tens of thousands of couples get down the aisle. And now that it's my turn, I'm not holding back. I'm bringing in my besties, wedding pros, and some brides-to-be you may know to talk through everything from picking the perfect venue to mastering your relationship. It's time to plan smarter so you can focus on the happily ever after. You've got the ring, we've got the rest. All right, switching gears this week, talking about something a little bit taboo, prenups and postnups. I know what you're thinking. Those are for celebrities, people with a lot of money. But that's not necessarily the case. This week, I'm sitting down with Renée Bauer, who is an award-winning divorce attorney. She's a published author and the founder of the family law firm Bauer Law Group. So we're going to talk all about divorce, prenups, postnups, red flags you should be looking out for in your relationships, and the conversations you should be having on your way to I do. There's a lot of great information packed into this episode. I hope you enjoy it and you learn something. Let's get into it. Hi, Renée. Thanks for joining our podcast today.
Thank you for having me.
So we're typically a wedding love podcast, but today we are talking about a topic that I feel like has been taboo. When you're talking about getting married and planning a wedding, nobody wants to say the D word, which is divorce. And what happens if or after does not, for some reason, your happily ever not work out the way you intended. So I'm excited to have this conversation because we want to empower our listeners to go into not just their wedding planning, but their life planning with their partner informed as to what their options are and what they should be looking out for. So excited to dive into all this, but before we get on topic, I'd love for you to just share about you, how you became a lawyer and how you fell into this field.
Yeah, so I never wanted to be a lawyer, quite frankly. And I never imagined I would have worked in the area of divorce law. I wanted to work in politics. And that's why I applied to law school, is I thought I was going to go to DC. I was going to work on Capitol Hill. I was going to have a job as a lobbyist. And so I said, well, if I'm going to go back to grad school, I might as well just go to law school and I can take that degree to DC with me. And when I started law school, I started an internship or an externship, and it was helping someone through Social Security benefits, and it was someone who needed it so badly. And I realized, I'm like, ooh, I think I like this work. I think I like working one-on-one with clients. And I never looked back. And it's funny because I will look back now and say, had I gone down that path and had I lived in DC, I would have been like chewed up and spit out. I would not have survived that environment. But after I graduated, I ended up working in a firm that did a lot of criminal law, and they also practiced family. And they were really well-known criminal attorneys and that did not want to do the family stuff. It just kind of came into them because they've been around for so long. It all fell in my lap. And that's when I realized that's the impact that I could make is with someone going through something really difficult in their life, and how can we turn this into a positive? And, people think like divorce, there isn't any positive to it, but there is. It's an opportunity on the other side. So the job was always part social work, part lawyer, part emotional cheerleader. And I loved that. I loved helping people see the possibilities of what can be, even though this unfortunate event has fell in their lap. And it was just a moment in their life and not their whole story.
And so for people who aren't familiar with what you mean by family law.
Yeah, so that would be anything related to divorce, was the one that most people will hear. You'll hear of family lawyers, matrimonial lawyers, divorce lawyers. It's all the same thing. So it's anyone who is going through a divorce, but sometimes will handle custody cases when you have two unwed parents. That also falls under family law too.
Okay, so you're working at a big law firm. How did you get to rolling out, starting your own firm, and focusing on divorce and helping people navigate that next kind of chapter of their lives?
So I was handling all of their divorce work, and I realized I really liked it. I also realized that I am an entrepreneur to my core, and like most entrepreneurs, like as kids, we had lemonade stands and we had all of these like side businesses that we created from our houses. I was one of those, and I looked at this firm and I'm like, oh, I would do this different. Like, ooh, we're not marketing well. Like, we need to brand ourselves. We need to change up the business model, and I couldn't do any of that because it wasn't my business. And I also at that time had just had my son, who is now 17 years old, but at the time he was the first one dropped off at daycare, the last one picked up. I had a commute to work. I was always in traffic. I was always stressed out. And I said, all right, I don't want to go into parenthood like this. I want some flexibility, and I want to be around. I don't want to miss things. So I made the difficult decision that even though this firm, they were like family to me, and I went into the firm owner's office, and I think I was crying when I told him the news, because it truly felt like family, that it was time for me to leave. And I started my own business on a folding table because the desk that I ordered didn't fit through the front door, measure your desk. And I had just a handful of clients, but I said, you know what, I'm going to do this my way. And it was fun for me to focus just on growing the business and the marketing and branding, which is stuff that I really love.
And now, fast forward, it's been almost 2 decades.
Yep.
You also have some personal experience with divorce. Do you care to give some color to that and share?
Sure. So, yeah, in that time, as I was building this family law business, I also found myself twice divorced. And the first one, I was married 5 years, and that's who I have my son with. And the second one was an oops, that was, jumping into something too fast and too quickly. And I extracted myself really fast when I saw the writing on the wall. But I had so much shame around it, and I never talked about it. So I kept my divorce story so separate from what I did for work. And I was like I was this buttoned up professional, and I would kind of go to court and click clack down the hallway in my heels and never share my own story because I was embarrassed by it. And then I went on a podcast one day with a friend of mine who started asking me about my divorce. I had no idea she was going to ask that. And I started sharing it. And after that podcast dropped, people messaged me and were like, thank you for talking about it. And thank you for being so vulnerable. And then I realized, these are the stories we need to share with each other. And then I started to realize, well, you can take the lessons that I learned of what not to do before going into marriage. And this isn't an anti-marriage or anti-love. Like, I love marriage. I married a third time and finally found my perfect partner in every sense of the word. Like, I love marriage. I also love planning a good wedding, but I wouldn't recommend you have to plan 3 of those. So, but it's just about conversations that we can start to have before you get into your marriage about what you can do to set it up for success. Or if you see any sort of red flags that you're like, oh, we'll work it out later, we'll figure it out, usually means that there's something going on that probably needs to be kind of dug out before you actually walk down the aisle.
Absolutely. I think having the hard conversations up front, and sometimes they don't even have to be hard. It's just having conversations up front that help you to navigate what is going to come ahead, right? I think I've seen stats on money being one of the number one reasons for divorce, right? People having different financial styles. Someone's a saver, someone's a spender. which is something we talk about a lot on Loverly, understanding your financial compatibility with your partner, right? Not just in planning your wedding, but in your marriage. Also, like religion being a big thing, like being aligned on values. Do you want to have children? You know, how do you want to raise those children? I mean, those are big questions that come up when you're in premarital counseling, which is, we actually had a really great therapist on the podcast where she kind of was helping us navigate those questions. But on the other side, right, when you say you have those conversations, but for some reason, right, you just can't seem to align. People grow, they change, they evolve. There's external factors that come in. You know, you want to be prepared and you want to go into this kind of eyes wide open. So, you know, from your own experience, but also not just personal, but dealing with clients, like what are some of those red flags that you see day in and day out, and maybe that you can share with our audience that they should be looking for?
So my husband will always joke that one of our first dates that we had, my current husband, that I sat down across from him and I kind of came out with this checklist. I wasn't physically holding a checklist, but I think it was like this mental. And I went through all of these questions on his religious beliefs, on his spending habits, on his, like all of these things, because I thought to myself, okay, I've done this twice already. Like I'm not necessarily looking for a third marriage. That wasn't why I was dating, but I'm like, I'm not going to waste my time, and I want to make sure that we're aligned. And if we're not, it's okay. We can release and let go and have peace with that. But I'm going to be really clear about what I'm looking for and what I need in a relationship. And so it starts there. And I think so often when people start dating and getting to know each other, they want it to work out. They're so hopeful, and they can, a lot of times women will see is start to change their behavior or modify it to fit what their partner wants.
The women will change their behavior.
The woman will change it, right? So it's like they don't want to upset, and the card. Then they want to keep things fun, and they want to keep it exciting. So then they start to, maybe something comes up that they don't feel so good about, and they don't speak up. Maybe that's, and it comes down to intuition. Like, this is a big one. It's your body's physical response to something. And I think that people don't pay enough attention to it. Is that something comes up and you kind of stuff it down and you're like, we'll deal with it later, or it's a growing pain. It's something that it's not a big deal. I'm just being sensitive, and they stuff it down.
Dismissing their own kind of like natural intuition or gut feeling that something's bothering them or not right, but not wanting to rock the boat.
Absolutely. And that's a big sign. So if someone is finding themselves not speaking up or bringing up something that's really important to them because they don't want to rock the boat, then that's a red flag. And it doesn't mean that it's the demise of the relationship. It just means there's a conversation that needs to be had. And now how is your partner receiving that? And that's going to tell you everything you need to know.
What's interesting about what you just said is I go into what are the red flags that you can see in a partner. That's really where I was going with the question. But I love that your answer has to do with someone taking the ownership of it, right? What am I afraid to say or engage in, or conversations am I afraid to have? Because at the end of the day, it makes sense that like people go in to a relationship wanting maybe that marriage, wanting that security, wanting all of those things. And it's a form of like self-abandonment, of not feeling comfortable to express ourselves. And I imagine that breeds resentment over time. And, they say that resentment's kind of like the stage you're at where it's like, it's really hard to come back from that, right, in a relationship.
Oh, absolutely. It's impossible to come back. I think that once you get to that level, there is no undoing resentment. It's really, really hard to change that course. So you get ahead of it. And so like so much of it is, how is your partner responding to any of you? If you're speaking up, how are they responding? Are they defensive? Are they fighting back? Are they telling you that, here's some phrases to watch out for? You're being too sensitive. You need to lighten up. Like those if you hear someone's very dismissive, it's gaslighting. And if you tell someone like your opinion doesn't matter, is essentially what they're saying when they're saying you're being too sensitive. They're turning it around on you. If you feel like you're walking around eggshells because you don't want to say the right thing, like that's a red flag. So pay attention to those things because they don't get better in marriage. Like marriage doesn't fix that stuff. It makes it exaggerates it and highlights it, if anything else. And so those are usually the signs that you either have to start having really serious conversations and try to and really see if this is something that can be worked out, or if you start actually speaking up and speaking your truth and expressing yourself, and your partner keeps pushing back and keeps fighting you or keeps dismissing you, then that's probably a sign that, you know what, maybe this isn't the best matchup.
What do you see as the biggest reasons for divorce? I mean, I've heard money. Obviously, you could think infidelity, but in your practice,
I actually don't think it's any of those. I think that those are things that happen because of lack of communication. Because if you're communicating with your spouse and you're talking about your needs and you're talking about things that upset you or you're talking about stressors, then you get ahead of that. Infidelity tends to come with most people because they don't feel loved. They don't have the attention they're looking for, the intimacy, both physical and emotional intimacy they're looking for. And so they go outwards to find that. And so if the couple is communicating and sharing all of the ways in which maybe they feel a disconnection and trying to bring it back and be intentional about bringing that connection back, then they can get ahead of that and it doesn't lead to other things. Money is always a big stressor with people, but that doesn't have to be the demise of the relationship, because again, it's like you go into the marriage and you're like, we can tackle anything together. And if money is a problem, then you can tackle that together too. But the key word here is together.
I want to talk about prenups because I feel like that is where a lot of people, when they think of divorce, especially with high profile couples, a lot of celebrities, the prenup always comes up. And it feels like it's something reserved for the rich and famous or, you know, the elite. But is that something that you would recommend to any couple going into a marriage?
So I've heard other lawyers say that everyone should get a prenup no matter what, and I don't agree with that. I think that it depends on your circumstances. So if you're two people coming out of college and you have debt and you're just starting out in your careers, and there's nothing else there aren't any assets, a prenup may not be necessary. But if you're someone who's maybe you're getting married later in life and maybe you've acquired property or assets or you have retirement accounts, or if this is a second marriage or beyond that and there's children, then a prenup might be appropriate for you. So it's not an all or it's, you know, everyone needs it no matter what. It depends on your circumstances. And it also depends on what state you live in, because some states, so Connecticut, for example, what you come into your marriage with is what you leave with. So if I come in with the house and I come in with retirement assets, only the things that would accumulate, so the increase in value of the house or the increase in value of the retirement is what is potentially at risk if there was a divorce, but all of the value of the pre-marriage would be safe. And so states have different rules for that. So I would say the best thing you can do is if before you get married, and don't wait the week before your wedding. We see this all of the time. People will come in and they'll be like, we're getting married next week and we need a prenup. Do not do that. Give yourself plenty of time so it's not stressful. Maybe start it when you've 6 months before, I would say would probably be a good timeline. Sit with a lawyer and just find out, is it appropriate for us to get a prenup? What assets do we have? What are we trying to protect? Sometimes a prenup could actually hurt you depending on which person is looking for the protection, because sometimes there'll be provisions in there that will prevent any sort of financial gain or alimony. So it's really going to depend on your situation. So sit down with the lawyer, get the information, have a conversation with your spouse. It is not, it's way more fun to talk about flowers and talk about the honeymoon, but it's such an important conversation to at least feel like everyone's on the same page going into the marriage as to what there is in assets and what's the best way for this couple to move forward.
Just something like a prenup actually cost.
Yeah, it depends on where you live because there are different rates for different attorneys. Like you could be in a part of, I'm in Connecticut. So in our state, we have an extremely wealthy part of our state that probably will charge, the lawyers are going to charge 800 to $1,000 or more an hour. So obviously it's going to be more expensive. If in some other states, the cost of attorneys are a little less, but I think a good ballpark is you're probably looking at about $1,500 for to have that drafted, to upwards to maybe 5,000. You know, it's going to depend on the complexity of the assets. It's going to depend on the complexity of the document. So if it's a very simple, it's going to be able to, you'll be able to keep the cost down. If it's more complex and there's some estate planning in terms of you have a lot in your estate, a lot of property, then a lot of disclosures, then it's going to be a little bit more expensive.
I imagine that the more that you're bringing into the marriage, whether it's homes or a trust or big bank accounts or 401ks or whatever it is, that potentially could add to that bill.
Of course. And the more that if the lawyer's just doing a simple a doc prep and it goes back and forth a couple times, the cost is going to be a lot less expensive than if you have, like what you talked about, businesses and things like that, that will require a little bit more of an extensive and customized contract.
Okay, so you mentioned that you don't think it's for everyone to get a prenup, but like what are like the things that would trigger someone to think, okay, I actually definitely should look into getting a prenup? Like what are the things that you would want to take an inventory of for you personally or for your partner when you're entering into a marriage?
If there's any sort of property, if there's a house, if there is a business or a family business, we'll see prenups a lot when there's a generational family business. And so the one person wants to protect that. If this is a second or third marriage, if you have kids, whether or not you've been married before, then you're going to want to put something into place to protecting your kids. If something were to happen and the marriage dissolved, you're going to want to have something that at least maintains some of those assets for the kids. Now, the flip side is we always talk about prenups and we always say, well, you know, why would you want to, assuming that you're the one who's holding all of the assets? But sometimes let's assume for a second that you're not the one who's holding all of the assets. If you're the one who is coming into that relationship and who doesn't have all of those things, then you may not want to push a prenup, quite frankly, because you may just enter it and say, okay, I don't want to put any constraints on potential alimony or potential getting any sort of equity and property. So everyone talks about the prenup from the perspective of protecting your assets, but what if you don't have assets? So, you know, certainly it's so hard to say that one, you know, every single couple fits the criteria to get one, because even if someone can come in and they just have a house and they may not need a prenup, but if you're a young couple and you're both just starting on your career, you may want, one person may want to, who has the more of the earning potential, and the other person may say, well, I don't think I want the prenup because you have a much more of an earning potential, and why do I want to cap alimony now, not knowing what your earnings could potentially be? So it's a little bit of a controversial take on it, because people want, you know, most attorneys will just talk about get the prenup and protect all of the things, but what if you don't have all of the things?
I am curious about the postnup. So I've also heard a lot of celebrities that like all of a sudden, or high net worth individuals, they go into a relationship without, you know, having a bunch of money or assets. And then as they get into a relationship, all of a sudden they start building assets. And this idea of a postnup comes up. First of all, can you just explain what a postnup is? And like, again, like when is an appropriate time for someone to, like, why would someone get one?
So it's far less common for someone to get a postnup. And what that is, all it is a prenup that is entered into after the marriage has already happened. So quite frankly, the only time I've ever seen people want a postnup is because their marriage is on the rocks and they're committing to working on it, but they want something in place in case things fall apart. So what gets a little tricky about this though is usually because people who are want the postnup, they're not coming as a happy couple looking forward to their honeymoon and they're just kind of doing this before they embark on their hopeful marriage. They're usually doing it because there's a reason for it. And what happens is they end up almost negotiating a divorce because they have to decide what happens with a lot of stuff. They have to decide what's going to happen, generally speaking, with property and money. And that can invoke arguments and anger. And so then it creates conflict and creates, it creates more problems. And so sometimes the courts won't even uphold them as well.
So basically they're pre-negotiating their divorce.
Kind of what it is. I mean, in the simplest terms, that is what they're doing, because every time that, in the 20 years I've been doing this, I can probably count on two hands the number of times I've done a postnup. And in all of those circumstances, it was because there was a rocky road and they're like, let's try to work on it, but let's get ahead of some of these things that potentially could be a problem if we're getting divorced. So and I have seen judges, and I'm thinking about the most recent ones, that they overturn the postnups because there's a variety of reasons, and they just don't uphold them. And they say that they were entered into under duress, or they weren't fair and equitable, or there wasn't all of the information. And so people find themselves right back at square one as if they did not have one. And for a prenup too, there's a whole host of reasons why prenups cannot be upheld, that people have to be mindful, which is why it's so important to make sure you have two separate lawyers reviewing them. You're not using one person. You're not rushing it before the wedding, which is a common one. And then the person will say, well, I felt rushed, and it's signed 3 days before the wedding. There's reasons that judges will decide to throw them out, and you're back to square one.
Oh, wow. So basically if it's, some type of circumstance, which is a high pressure situation, oftentimes those prenups will be completely thrown out and judges won't even acknowledge them.
It happens.
I mean, that makes sense. But again, is that not a red flag if someone slips you a prenup like 2 days before your wedding day?
I know. And sometimes it's just because like family pressure, like we'll see it like, hey, we just want to get this done. Our family's pressuring us. There's a family business and everyone's, there isn't any sorts of conflict, and they just, and even in that circumstance, I say, make sure you have two separate lawyers reviewing it so that it's upheld. So a lot of times people do wait to the end because they're so busy planning the wedding and all the fun stuff that this is like an afterthought. And it's like, oh, we got to get this thing done. And then it's a rush to get it done. So that's why I always say you should probably, if you're going to do this, do it like 6 months in advance. And then you don't want to be like getting your makeup trial and then you're reviewing a prenup. Like, talk about taking the fun out of something. Like, get it done well in advance so that it's like out of sight, out of mind.
Totally. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I am really curious, if you don't get a prenup and a relationship doesn't work out, and say you've only been married for a year or 5 years or 10 years, how does what you've created in the marriage change over a period of time? Like, who's entitled to what?
Yeah.
Generally, I know that different states probably have different rules, but like, how should someone think about that?
Yeah, you just, with your first situation, it's like, if you've only been married a year, you just described my second marriage. And so, just throwing myself right into it to say, like, we just each left with what we had. So with a year marriage, it was, nothing's accumulated. We didn't accumulate joint anything. We didn't have joint names on anything. We didn't own joint property. So we just left with like, okay, we're out. So the longer the marriage is, though, the less likely that will happen. So when you start to commingle things, and let's say you sell a house, and then you say I own the house and I sell my house and I take all those funds to buy another house with my spouse, now things get a little bit more complicated. You can still go back and say, okay, that $100,000 was from the sale of the house that I had before we got married, but any increase in value of that house becomes joint. So look at it this way, anything that you build together, whether it's your retirement accounts that build an equity while you're married, your equity in your house, in your bank accounts, the debt, even the debt that you accumulate during your marriage, becomes joint. So a lot of people don't like to hear that, the debt part of it, because they're like, well, my husband was a spender and we have 20 grand in credit card debt because of him. But if it was all acquired during the marriage, usually the other argument is, well, I was doing it to pay for a vacation or pay for household things in Home Depot,
Mm.
and it becomes joint debt too. So all the good and the bad and the ugly too all become joint, everything that sort of amasses during the marriage.
But what happens in the circumstances where a lot of couples are together quite a long time before they actually get married, right? Like 4 or 5 years. And then, by the time they're married, it's now 7, 8 that they've been together. Does that kind of clock start ticking when the relationship starts, or when they actually say, I do, get married, become legally spouses?
Great question. The clock starts the minute you say I do. So if you spent 5 or 10 years with that person, none of that time counts. And it's happened. Like, you'll have someone who they've been together 10 years and they get married and the marriage lasts 1 year. And they're like, but we've been together 10 years. It doesn't matter. According to the court, it's 1 year they're looking
Wow. Okay, so just make sure that you are ready to get married when you're ready to get married.
at. Right?
Switching gears a little bit, and I know you said that you mentioned on a previous podcast that you had shared some of your personal story. I am interested now, you as a lawyer, someone who has now been through 2 divorces and now is in a successful marriage, right? What are the things that you wish you knew going into that first marriage? And I know you shared a lot of kind of general advice here, but was there anything in
Yeah.
particular for you that you really wish you would have known? And you, as someone who is, a practicing family attorney, right, that even you were surprised by.
Yeah, so get this one. This is because there was a huge moment for me, and not that I think that we were a good match. We weren't when I look back at it. But what I own in that marriage is I didn't want conflict. I avoided conflict like the plague, to the point where I was actually not taught speaking about the things that were important to me, because it was easier to just go along to get along. And what happened is, what we talked about, is that resentment built in a really big way. And because I had shoved things under the rug for so long, and think about, like, as a lawyer, that was my job, is to, like, live in this place of conflict. But yet in my personal life, I did not want to go home to that. So I didn't bring it up, and we never fought. Like, we did not fight, but it was, any strong opinions that were different from mine, I didn't really stand my ground, and I didn't say, and I should have, of say, like, hey, listen, there is an issue that needs to be addressed now, not 5 years later when I have all of this resentment from it, and, like, to get a grasp on that. And that's why I speak, so passionately about, have these uncomfortable conversations, even if they're hard now, because it can be way harder later on when you have all of that resentment. And that's what I own in that relationship. And I vowed, going into the marriage I'm in, I will never make that mistake again. So now, as soon as something comes up, I speak it. I speak it, he speaks it, we deal with it,
Mm.
so that resentment is never, ever there.
Working with a number of couples in your practice, have there been any, like, just horror stories that stand out to you that you would share? I mean, obviously you have attorney-client privilege and all of that, but, like, is there a story or a couple or a theme of something that you were particularly either disturbed by or surprised by, as far as a dynamic coming out of a divorce?
I mean, there's so many interesting stories. Like, I have the story of the guy who moved out of the house to move into, I think he went to the Waldorf in New York, if not the Waldorf, another high-end hotel, and spent 40 grand on porn. Like, that's what he charged on his wife's credit card. So, like, that was like, you know, that was one that
Oh
stands
my
out.
God.
But one of my favorite stories is a woman who, a few years back, she so struggled with going through the divorce, and she did not want it. She, loved her life. And she, every step of the way, she would have stayed married, but her husband was really pushing it, and she never handled the money. And she really was afraid of being alone. And about a year after her divorce, she reached out to me to say, I never realized how unhappy I was until I spent time on the other side of this thing. And I love that, because
Mm.
it's like, even when you're so terrified of something and you're so scared of, like, if you're not the one who's handled the money, like, you can still make it on the other side. And sometimes, I mean, I think this goes just for life in general. Sometimes we don't even know the possibility of what can be on the other side of something. It could be a job or relationship, until we're forced to actually face it. And sometimes it's like the universe giving us a nudge, forcing us into something really uncomfortable, because it knows that it's way better for us than staying stagnant.
That is so true. And oftentimes, like, the hardest things end up being the best thing for
Mhm.
you. Like, even looking back at, like, just relationships that end, right? Without the whole marriage attachment,
Yeah.
right? That it always ends up leading to something better. I am curious, in your practice and just generally, is it the men or the women asking for the divorce most of the time?
It's both. Although I think I saw a statistic lately that said women are the ones who actually file more than men, which I think is really interesting. So I think it's definitely, we see both coming through, but I do think that women, when they are done, they're done. And I think men hold on a little bit longer. When women get to that point and, they're like, I'm out, I'm not putting up with this anymore, they are out, and there's no turning back. Because they do, you see different clients show up, and you see the ones who are so confident, like, this is going to happen, I'm done, I'm ready to move on, let's go. And then you see the ones like the client that I just shared, who's really has a fear. And usually it's because they weren't the ones handling money, or something like that, and they're afraid of being independent or alone.
Yeah, I can see that, like, financial stress being a big reason why someone would hold on to maybe a toxic relationship, because the fear
Yeah.
of what might happen. Well, I'm hoping that we shared some, we demystified, I should say, the prenup and divorce, and you've been such a wealth of knowledge, Renee. For anyone who's interested in continuing to learn more from you, um, where can they find you? And I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, so Instagram is my favorite place to hang out. I respond to all of my messages there, and that is at Ms. Renee Bauer. And I have a book coming out in September, and I'm giving away a bunch of free bonuses attached to the book, and that's shewhowinsbook.com.
Love that. Well, I will be checking out that book for sure. And I'm hoping that I'll never have to call you personally,
I
but
know,
I
right?
did learn a lot on this.
Just keep talking to each other, and then you'll be good.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode. If you've enjoyed this podcast and want more inspiration and guidance, check out our new and improved wedding planning platform at loverly.com, where we offer free wedding planning tools and advice to get you hitched without a hitch. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram and TikTok at Loverly. Happy planning.